So as you guys probably know, every month I build at least one computer on my channel, and last month in July I actually built two, but I didn't actually test either of them yet, and that is what today's video is all about. Should you, the aspiring PC builder at home, set your sights on a build like this, around $1,000, featuring an AMD Ryzen 3600X and an RX 5700 from Radeon? Or should you just go all out, spend about $4,000 on a system like this with the 3900X and an RTX 2080 Ti? Or maybe something in between, who knows? Today I'm gonna test both of them and give you guys the results.
Excellent!
Cooler Master's MK730 gaming mechanical keyboard is the more portable version of their flagship Master Keys 750 and features the same premium brushed aluminum finished and floating key design, as well as genuine Cherry MX switches in blue, brown, or red. Use the function keys for on-the-fly RGB LED control, admire the stylish bottom and side light bars, and feel the comfort of the removable wrist rest in a 10 keyless form factor that you can easily take on the go. It's got USB Type-C too, so click the sponsor link in the description for more.
So let's start out with a quick recap of the hardware that we're working with today. On my left, we have a system that's going to cost you about $1,000. It features an AMD Ryzen 5 3600X, and yes, we're using the stock heatsink fan along with that. The motherboard is the MSI B450 Tomahawk, and the memory I picked out is a G.Skill Sniper X kit that runs at DDR4 3600. DDR4 3600 is the recommended speed that you should run on if you're doing an AMD Ryzen build, especially if you're on Ryzen 3rd gen. However, I should point out that both of these kits have had their memory swapped out, so I could use the exact same memory in both. So right now they're both using a G.Skill Flare X kit that's running at 3200 speed, cast latency 14. I've got 16 gigs in 2 sticks in this system and 32 gigs in 4 sticks in this system. For storage, we have an ADATA 500GB NVMe M.2 SSD. The graphics card is the AMD Radeon RX 5700. The case is actually the NZXT H510 Elite, although what I'm recommending if you put this together is to just go with the standard H510 or the standard H500, which cost a good 70 or 80 bucks less. That's fine, I don't care. And finally, we have a Cooler Master MWE 650 watt 80 plus gold rated power supply. The system on my right is going to cost you a lot more, close to $4,000, about $3,850 by my estimates. But when I built this system, I actually parted it out two ways. There is a much less expensive version, which costs about $2,100 or $2,200. That's in the video description for this original build if you want to check it out. But what this is rocking is the 12-core, 24-thread AMD Ryzen 9 3900X processor. It's cooled by the Cooler Master Master Liquid ML360R RGB liquid CPU cooler, and that cooler as well as the intake are both using the Cooler Master triple fan solution, which is called the SF360R ARGB, 320mm fans in the same housing that lets you connect all of their RGB lights up at the same time, which is nice. The motherboard is the MSI Meg X570 Ace ATX AM4 motherboard. I originally kitted it out with 4 of these Team T-Force Nighthawk RGB DDR4 memory sticks, which look really, really nice. These are rated at 3200 speed though, which actually would have been fine, but just again for the sake of comparison, I used the same memory in both kits, which is why I removed this briefly. For storage, we have an Aorus 2TB PCIe 4.0 NVMe SSD, which is absolutely insane when it comes to read and write speeds, as well as an Intel 660p 2TB M.2 NVMe SSD. So that gives us 4 terabytes of solid state storage in this system, which is really nice, I must admit. The graphics card is probably the most overkill piece of hardware in the system. It's the MSI Lightning RTX 2080 Ti, which is absolutely insanely overbuilt. Comes with a support beam because it's a triple slot cooler, has 3 8-pin power connectors for PCI Express graphics power. It's really hard to find these cards. They're supposed to retail for $1,600, but that is, again, the part of the reason why this system costs so much. You can get RTX 2080 Ti's for about 500 bucks less than that, but I wanted to showcase this card and see what it could do. It's all housed in the Lian Li PC011 Dynamic Razor Edition case, a special edition of this really nice case from Lian Li, and powered by an EVGA Supernova G3 750 watt 80 plus gold fully modular power supply. Both systems are running the latest updated version of Windows 10 1903, and they both have the latest versions of their respective graphics cards drivers, AMD or NVIDIA. Jumping into testing though, I'm going to start out by going over frequencies, temperatures, power draw, and noise levels, because I think those are sort of the things you don't necessarily consider right away when you're comparing two systems. A lot of times people will go directly for the CPU performance or the graphics card performance, but I think these specs are important because they're both rocking Zen 2 based CPUs from the Ryzen 3000 series, which are both both based on 7nm manufacturing process, so they should have somewhat similar performance, at least when it comes to a single core. The CPU on the $950 system ran at about 4.325 GHz max, and on average, under sustained load was at about 4.25 GHz, which is pretty nice. The GPU, the RX 5700, was running at 1,744 MHz max, and then under sustained load, fluctuating from about 1650 to 1700, sometimes dipping down to 1635. Meanwhile, on the almost $4,000 PC, the CPU hit a astounding 4.475 GHz max, which is crazy when you consider that this is the higher core count version of these 7nm processors. But under sustained load, it dropped down to about 4.15 to 4.2 GHz on average. Still very nice for a sustained all-core frequency, but again, that is a little bit less than what you're going to get on the 3600X running at all cores and all threads. Our Lightning 2080 Ti, meanwhile, was able to hit 2010 MHz max, just over 2 GHz, which is pretty nice. Again, under sustained load, that frequency is going to drop down a bit, but it was around 1920 to 1950 on average, which is, I think, a couple ticks higher than my previous fastest RTX 2080 Ti, which is the Asus Strix version, which would usually get to around 1900. Meanwhile, for temperatures, on the $950 system, the CPU hit only 72 degrees Celsius max, which is a testament to the cooling performance of this air cooler that ships with the 3600X, which is the Wraith Spire. However, I can hear it even right now. More on that in just a second. Average temperatures, meanwhile, on the 3600X were between 56 and 59 degrees Celsius average, which is perfectly acceptable. Our 5700 GPU was running at about 77 degrees Celsius max, and then on average, just a couple degrees below that, usually around 75 or 76. So I'm still sort of keeping an ear to the ground for third-party versions of these 5700 and 5700 XT cards, because I do think that there is more cooling performance to be had there, and then maybe potentially a little bit more graphics performance as well. Our $4,000 build over here does have more cooling in the form of additional intake fans, 3x120, and then it's got the exhaust at the top through the radiator as well. A total of 6 fans, but our CPU was still able to get up to 75 degrees Celsius max, although on average it was about 60 to 65 degrees Celsius, and then on occasion, while it was doing some more CPU intensive stuff, getting to around 70 degrees. Our GPU, meanwhile, hit 78 degrees Celsius max, which is kind of what you would expect for an RTX 2080 Ti. They tend to ramp themselves up until they get hot enough to kick the fan in, and then it cools itself off a little bit. Speaking of which, average temperatures were between 70 and 75 degrees Celsius on the card, and that was pretty much based on the fan speed. The fans would run slower until the card got to about 75 degrees Celsius, then the fans would ramp up just a little bit, barely even noticeable, and then it would get down to about 70, and then it would sort of repeat that over and over again. Lastly, power draw, and this was measured during the 3D Mark Firestrike Ultra combined test. The $950 PC was running at 253 watts on average during the test, peaked at 297 watts, so I'm impressed that this entire system is never really going to draw more than 300 watts total, considering that it has a 650 watt power supply, plenty of headroom there, so that's pretty nice. Our larger system draws a lot more power, 463 watts on average, so actually more than 200 watts more is what you're going to draw with this system. 539 watts peak power draw, but that is something to keep in mind. You get a lot more performance with this system, you're spending a lot more money, but you're drawing a good amount of extra power too. It's like the amount of power you draw for a complete additional system, so that's something you should probably also keep in mind, especially if power costs a lot where you live. Next, we have some noise levels tests. I let the systems run for about 10 minutes until they got nice and warm, and then I just pointed my shotgun mic at them, or at various parts of them. This system here, $4,000, super quiet. As you can probably hear, nothing more than a soft whoosh here and there, and even under full load, like you can barely hear it. And that is to be expected, I think. If you're investing in parts that are of this high quality, they should be very quiet at the same time. Meanwhile, over here, So as you can hopefully hear there, the main thing in this system making noise is that stock heatsink fan. And I'm so torn about that stock heatsink fan because it does have pretty good performance considering that it's cooling a pretty high frequency 6-core 12-thread processor. But it is loud, you can hear it. Even with my open headphones on, playing a video game right next to it, I did some Overwatch on the system, I could hear it ramp up when it increases or decreases speeds. So that I think is the weak link in this system when it comes to the overall experience. And especially when I was pointing the mic straight down from the top, yeah, you can hear that ramping up and down. So let me tell you guys what I'm gonna do. This month, in August, I'm going to be doing sort of a refined version of this system, and I think for that, I'm gonna go with an aftermarket cooler. So if you guys are considering buying right now, I would seriously consider the extra 30 or 40 bucks that it would cost you to get something like a Hyper 212 Black Edition. Swap it in there, you're gonna get better cooling performance, and it's gonna be a lot quieter, which I think makes a big difference, especially if you're gonna be gaming right next to the system. Now let's get into some actual benchmarks, and we're starting off with 3D Mark. I ran Firestrike Ultra as well as TimeSpy Extreme to get a DirectX 11 and DirectX 12 representation. When it comes to Firestrike Ultra, we had my top single GPU score on a system which was 8,748 points overall with a graphics score of 8,514. Meanwhile, our $950 system had an overall score of 5,319, a graphics score of 5,295, and a CPU score of 19,145. I think this is a very good overall view of these two systems and the relative performance, specifically when it comes to gaming, and also when it comes to CPU performance. We're going to see more on that in just a minute when we get to the CPU-specific tests, but do bear in mind when you're comparing the scores of these two systems, you also need to keep in mind the price. About $1,000 versus about $4,000, or about $1,000 versus a system whose performance level you could put together for, I would say, about $2,500. Meanwhile, on 3D Mark TimeSpy Extreme, which is a DirectX 12 test, we had a score of 6,955 for our almost $4,000 build, and a graphics score of 7,064 for our RTX 2080 Ti Lightning Edition, and a CPU score of 6,634. We can compare that to the $950 build's score of 3,500 overall, 3,522 for the graphics, and 3,381 for the CPU. Here's a look at some numbers from Battlefield 5. This is running at 4K, 3840 by 2160. We had an average frame rate of 57 frames per second for the $950 system, and the frame rate jumped up to 84 FPS when it comes to the $4,000 system. So that's a few extra FPS for a lot more money. I also want to point out here that my $950 build went about 2 FPS faster with the standard RX 5700 than it did when the RX 5700 was tested with the 9900K. So that, I think, is also a good indication of the fact that these processors from AMD are just as viable for gaming as what Intel has on offer right now, and they tend to cost a lot less for what you get in CPU performance. Moving over to 2560 by 1440, we have an average frame rate of 99 FPS for the $950 build with a 73 FPS 1% low. Then we have an average FPS of 135 with the $3,850 build with a 1% low of 113. And our last test here is Metro Exodus running in DirectX 12 mode. First off at 4K 3840 by 2160, about 31.1 average FPS for the $950 build with a 1% low of 21.7, compared to the $4,000 build's 51.2 average FPS, so you get about 20 frames more for your money with the more expensive build, and a 1% low of 34. Moving over to 2560 by 1440, the $950 build got 51 average frames per second and 30.8 1% low frames per second, 79.8 average FPS for the $3,850 build with a 1% low of 45.4. Let's switch over to some tests that focus on compute performance, starting off with Cinebench R20, the new version of Cinebench. You can run it in single-thread mode or multi-thread mode, and multi-thread mode is where our 12-core, 24-thread processor is going to shine with an overall score of 7,019 compared to our 6-core, 12-thread processor's score of 3,660. If we look at the single-thread scores, though, they are much closer. 492 for the 3600X, 494 for the 3900X, and I would say that if you're running these under sustained load, you'd actually probably get a better score with the 3600X when it comes to single core performance, because as you might have seen when we were talking about frequencies, under sustained load, this was actually running at about 50 to 100 megahertz faster than this was. Our next test is Handbrake. We were transcoding a 4K 40 megabits per second video file down to 1080 using the fast preset. The $950 PC, 266.4 seconds total. Meanwhile, the $3,850 PC took only 153.8 seconds. Not quite half the time when it comes to the $3,850 PC, but definitely you can see how that investment of money is potentially going to save you time in the future if you're doing a lot of video transcoding, which is a very good use case for a higher core count and thread count CPU. Our last test here is V-Ray version 4.10.07, $950 PC, got 10,482 K samples, and the $3,850 PC got 19,685. So here we're seeing a little bit closer to linear scaling when it goes from 6 cores up to 12 cores. Now you still get a little bit of fall off in the interim, probably due to clock speeds as well as some other factors, but still, both systems beastly at this task, but yeah, this computer was faster. Before I conclude this video, let's talk about some extra things, intangibles, if you will, between these two systems and what you might get or not get one way or the other. I think one thing is Wi-Fi. This system has Wi-Fi. This system does not. It's just not a feature that shipped with the motherboard. Granted, you can get a Wi-Fi USB adapter for like 10 or 20 bucks, so it might not be a huge deal, but it is something you don't have out of the box, something to consider. RGB lighting. They both have RGB lighting. You could connect more RGB lighting up to this motherboard because it has headers for it. This one just has a bit fancier RGB lighting. It has the infinity window over there above the CPU power delivery area. Beyond the motherboard, both of the cases have RGB functionality as well. I want to point out that I never installed the CAM software on this system over here, which is why the fans are still white, but I actually just kind of like how they look there. And you do get a bit of red accent on the motherboard there too. But beyond that, we've got much fancier lighting and RGB on the MSI Lightning RTX 2080 Ti, as well as a bit on the all-in-one liquid CPU cooler, and some really cool lighting effects, I would say, on this Lian Li case that aren't necessarily what you would get with every case. The NZXT case over here is relying on the fans for RGB lighting as well as some LED strips, and also you're only going to get those LED strips if you go with the more expensive H510i or H510 Elite version of this case. I think the lucky animation over here on the RTX 2080 Ti Lightning is also an intangible and potentially worth the cost of this entire system by itself because it's very cute and he falls asleep from time to time, and I just have to point that out. My $950 build over here does not have an animation of Lucky the Dragon on the side of its graphics card, which I think is probably its greatest failing. I would also need to point out that my $950 build does not have a huge amount of storage. We have a 512 gig NVMe SSD, a nicer NVMe SSD that's a bit faster, but usually when I part out the systems that are a little bit more on the budget side, I kind of assume that you might have a 2 terabyte hard drive lying around that you can drop in there, or that you might be willing to spend 30, 40, 50 bucks on a little bit of extra storage, but that's not something that was included outright, whereas over here, you're working with 4 terabytes of SSD storage right out of the gate, as well as more space in there to add more storage. Well, both of the systems have more space to add more storage, but probably something that's more of a consideration for the $950 build than the $3,850 system. You could also point out that we have more memory, 32 gigs versus 16 gigs. That may or may not be worth your while. I did not use more than the 16 gigs in any of my testing here, so if you're going to do video editing or something like that, that would be worth investing in more memory, but you can easily get away with 16 gigs. And then the biggest difference that I think I've mentioned once or twice, these do cost different amounts of money, almost $4,000, about $1,000. So that is probably going to be the biggest difference for those of you guys at home. But I hope my testing today has given you guys a better idea of what type of performance you can expect out of a system that you put together, especially on this AMD Ryzen platform. And I think maybe a good indication of why I tend to lead towards system builds that are maybe in the $800 to $1,000 range, because you don't always get insanely more performance when you jump up to $2,000 or $3,000 or even going beyond that. Also worth pointing out, this system here is upgradable. You can take the 3900X, drop it in here. You can take the 2080 Ti and drop it in here. And yeah, again, that would make it more expensive, but you've got an upgrade path either way. So let me know what you guys think of these builds and my testing methods down in the comments section if you guys have any feedback for me. I will be doing this again next month, maybe not in exactly the same format, but I do have a couple more builds coming at you real soon. Speaking of which, hit the thumbs up button and subscribe to my channel if you're not already, if you want to see those builds once I publish them. Thank you guys so much for watching this video, and we'll see you next time.